Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. And as usual, I have an animal in my face. It's been a while since I've filmed an episode of my friend the Rainbow Circle, since before the new year, for various reasons. One of the reasons was this whole thing was ransacked, and everything was a big mess, because I got so many things stolen from this spot. At least I'll call it that. I have two animals on my lap right now. But I watched a lot of things over the Christmas break. I got a bunch of ideas and forgot a bunch of ideas for videos, and I just never got around to shooting. Finally, I got all this cleaned up. One of the things I watched, it was a very New Year's Eve sort of a thing to watch, or Christmassy, I should say, sort of thing to watch. I watched a lot of The Muppet Show. I watched a lot of James Bond and a lot of The Muppet Show. I'm trying to think of a good idea for James Bond. But The Muppet Show, Muppet Show, very much associated with Christmas. It's well past Christmas now, of course, but I'm catching up. But The Muppet Show, one of the things I noticed about The Muppet Show was precisely how many of the characters, how many of the iconic characters really fit. If I can get around my dog. Level 2 on the Rainbow Circle. The paradox, level 2 on the Rainbow Circle. And I think that's precisely why they work so well, is because of the paradox. Why they've become iconic and, enjoyable and all these different things. Oh, God. Okay, there goes the dog. And speaking of dogs, if you think about, for example, Rolf, some of the the two earliest, arguably, really iconic Muppets were Rolf and Kermit. And Rolf is great. I love Rolf. He has a great design and all that sort of stuff. Really enjoyable to watch with the fingers on the piano. He has this really enjoyable design. Seiko, come here. Poor Seiko was so sick just a week ago. Poor Seiko has epilepsy. My baby Seiko has epilepsy. Mwah, my baby. Maybe this is why I'm thinking about dogs. But Rolf has just beautiful design with the fingers and just the floppy ears, all that stuff is so much fun. But one of the best, arguably one of the best puppet designs that they have. One of the earliest, one of the most iconic. But who really considers Rolf their favorite? I always struggled to figure out who my favorite Muppet was. Because I relate pretty closely to Kermit, Fozzy, and Gonzo, and it's really hard to pick between those three and say who of the really iconic Muppets from the Muppet Show I really relate to most. But for various reasons, I relate to all three of those. But who really considers Rolf their favorite? And I think that's kind of telling about how that works on that level of stimulant value. Because an art piece, a visual art piece, has a significant level of stimulant value. Hold on, there's a cat making noise. Bo, what are you doing? Bo, get out! I got your attention, okay. Bo, what are you doing? Bo just wants to chew up everything. There's never really been an iconic Muppet cat, which is a shame, really a shame. Not one I could think of. But anyway, so a visual art piece has a significant level of stimulant value. So one of the things I did over break is we went to see a Van Gogh art exhibit, and we went to see, Callum and I went to see Van Gogh art exhibit and a Lego art exhibit. He loved the Lego art exhibit a lot more, of course, but if you think about, even the great artists, like Van Gogh, and a lot of the Lego artists were great artists. I will definitely say that. Even the greatest artists, how much stimulant value does it have just on viewing it? Can you sit there for an hour and stare at a Van Gogh? Even the greats like Van Gogh, can you sit there for an hour and stare at a Van Gogh? Could come back to Van Gogh over and over again and have the stimulant value return. But it's hard to say, even these. I went to see the Columbia Museum, and even something like Rothko, notoriously, and I've talked about Rothko before, but notoriously Rothko, and his influence on me, clearly, Rothko and Kenneth Noland and Jasper Johns and Joseph Albers and guys like that clearly had an influence on my art style. Even stuff with characters in it, that color contrast is hugely influential. But if you could stare at Rothko for a long, long time, but could you stare at Rothko for as long as you'd stare at, as long as you'd watch a Muppet show? But it's still telling. It's still, if you want to think about how the stimulant value works, if you want to extend that stimulant value over a long period of time, the animals haven't been here in a while, so they're getting into everything and knocking over everything. So you might hear animal chaos in the background, which is kind of fitting, the topic. But anyway, if you think about stimulant value, long-term stimulant value, extending it over a period of time, it's good to look at things that have lasted a long time. How many decades have the Muppets lasted and continue to entertain people and stimulate people? How long has Van Gogh lasted? I mean, any one of those you can certainly consider. But if you look at a character like Rolf, I would say Rolf is a beautiful design, but he functions much more like a visual art piece. You look at Rolf and you say, "Oh, that's just a wonderful, just very delightful sort of design." He plays a song, that's and he tells some jokes and it's fun for about 5 minutes or so. But what really sticks with you beyond that, what is Rolf's personality besides his great design? And the design is part of it. I mean, all the Muppets have these great designs, but the design is certainly part of it. But if you consider the really iconic Muppets, the ones that are usually people's favorites, what is really the long-term stimulant value of a character like Kermit? Kermit is the leader of the show. I mean, if you think of he shows up in so many contexts, but the Muppet Show is just fresh on my mind. But if you think of, Kermit, he's the leader of the show, but he's the smallest and the weakest. He tries to command everyone, but he's so weak. So you have that, and then he blows up. So you have that. Let's take a look at the rainbow circle. So you have that. There you go. The core stimulant value, which could be short term, could be long term. How do you extend that out? If you move on one step into the paradox-parataxis contrast between what you see on the surface and what a character displays under the surface, you have that ambition. Clearly Kermit has this ambition to be strong and in control. Things fall out of control. He blows up in anger. And that's really a compelling dynamic that makes him far more compelling than just a character like Rolf. What is Rolf's paradox? I love Rolf, but what is Rolf's paradox? What sort of contrast does he have? He's just, lighthearted, fun-loving. That doesn't let too much bother him. Whereas Kermit tries to keep things under control. He has that, and it's that playing drunk principle, which is exponentially better way of considering subtext than the iceberg. The iceberg's horrible. I have videos about that. But playing drunk is the idea that on the surface you're trying to keep control, but under the surface you have this dynamic that's sort of trying to force its way up. And for Kermit, partly that's clearly his rage issues. He has suppressed rage issues. He's trying to keep control, but he's too weak to keep control. The show falls out of control and he blows up in anger. So that dynamic makes him a really compelling character that you can really love and be attached to, and creates a long-term stimulant value more so than a character like Rolf, who's really just a great design really for very short 2-3 minute segments. Then you have Fozzy. One of the things I watched was a compilation of the Fozzy bits. And Fozzy, kind of the joke of Fozzy is that he's a bad comedian. How do you make comedy segments about a bad comedian? How do you make them funny? And the dynamic that works really well with Fozzie there is his interaction with Waldorf and Statler. That's where Waldorf and Statler are throughout the whole thing, undercutting pretty much everything. And that they work with the Kermit dynamic as well. But Waldorf and Statler work with Fozzie, just making fun of Fozzie. But Fozzie has this delusion that he is a good comedian. He has this delusion that what he's doing is really funny. And he has to force himself externally. He has to convince himself externally that what he's doing is of value and that people will value it. But the only feedback he ever gets is from Waldorf and Statler, and it's actually the whole dynamic is really really depressing. And so I think that dynamic between Fozzie and Kermit is the heart of the show. Clearly, the fact that Kermit loses control of everything so easily. Fozzie needs reinforcement to keep going. It's a very depressing story, under the surface. And another thing about Kermit that I think is that sort of paradoxical drive is that, if you think of the songs really associated with Kermit, the songs are very depressing, bleak sort of songs. Beautiful songs. Some of the most beautiful songs ever in film or television. It's Not Easy Being Green. Beautiful song. He's identifying what is the source of his feelings of isolation, the source of his feelings of depression. Kermit is a very depressed character, and depressing character in many ways. But he's identifying that as his external feature, just being green. Probably, there's a lot more going on than just merely being green. But he says he struggles being green. And that sort of is an indication of all these other layers of different psychological issues that he likely has that lead to things like, desperation for control, explosions of anger, that sort of thing. And the Rainbow Connection, one of my favorites. Clearly I like rainbows, but the Rainbow Connection. Just the idea that, he's the lovers and the dreamers in me. He struggles for some sort of connection with others. He can't quite connect with others and remains an outcast. The image of him just playing his banjo alone on the log is just this beautiful image. And so, the irony there is just the whole dynamic of the Muppets is you have all these characters who collect together, but so many of them are lonely and isolated characters who are deluded into believing they are better at something than they actually are. Kermit is deluded in believing he's able to control this crazy show. Fozzie is deluded into believing that he's a good comedian, but he never grows or progresses. And I think that disproves the notion that great characters have to progress. I know it's kind of a weak argument to say that these characters on this kids show are great characters. I think they're wonderful, amazing characters. Somebody could easily refute that and say, "Oh, they're not really great characters. They're just great kids show characters." I disagree personally, but I would say it refutes the notion that great characters change, because these characters really shouldn't change, arguably. But there's the other dynamic where the Kermit and Miss Piggy dynamic, where Miss Piggy's paradox is that she has this self-perception that she's very dainty, that she's very ladylike, that she's very demure, that she's this leading lady. Everybody's awful to her, and she explodes into anger far more so than Kermit does. But she's trying to keep control. She's trying to remain ladylike, but she explodes into anger. And clearly, the Piggy Kermit relationship is a very, very bad idea. Kermit clearly does not want it. Piggy very much wants it. Wants to have this relationship. But it's a relationship based on delusions and rage, and therefore it's bound to be a horrible relationship. And And I think that's the dynamic of the show that works so well is Piggy pursuing Kermit, Kermit running away from Piggy, Kermit recognizing that it's bound to be just you know a powder keg of a relationship, and it's never going to work out. She's going to just wreck him as a person, um, because she has that delusion that she's much more demure and ladylike, and this sweet and pleasant and kind leading lady. Clearly, she's you know a bundle of rage. Kermit recognizes that. She recognizes she doesn't recognize it's a bad idea. Um, and I think when they do change, when they do develop, that marks an end. That's not a marker of what would make them a great character. That's the marker of an end. Like when they got married. I think in one of them, one of the movies. And it's a wonderful, wonderful scene when they get married. But in I'm blanking on which of the movies it is, but I think it's like Muppets Take Manhattan. I think one of those. I think it's Muppets Take Manhattan. Let me know in the comments if I'm totally wrong. But when they get married, that closes off a story that was sort of the climax of the more purely Muppet oriented movies. They started doing more adaptation based, like Treasure Island and stuff like that. They started doing more, and Muppets Wizard of Oz, of course. Um, and Christmas Carol. I had heard a lot of people talking about just how great the Muppets Christmas Carol is, and those are great movies. It's just those are movies where the story is not about the Muppets, and I think the whole idea that Kermit and Piggy would change who they are and develop as characters and reach a place where they can get married marks an end. It's not something that makes them better characters that they change. It's something that marks the end of that particular tension characters. And then there's Gonzo, and I think one of the more Muppet based ones was Gonzo finding his family. I think that might have been the last, just more specifically about the Muppets, where Gonzo finds out that he's an alien, and I think that's undermining one of the tensions that's really delight in the whole show. You have the series. I would say those are the four iconic characters, really. There's so many great characters, but those are the really, the top four that are always the most iconic. But Gonzo, the mystery of who he is as a character, his outcast status. All four of the iconic characters are really outcasts who don't really know who they are, don't really understand themselves, have this tension built in, the paradox of who they present themselves to be versus who they actually are. And Gonzo's probably the most self-aware in the sense that he recognizes he's a weirdo, but his true origin is a mystery. And I think that's one of the dynamics that just finding out he's an alien entirely undermines. I think you find out he's a weirdo, that he's one of a kind, and all that sort of stuff creates this sort of mysterious dynamic with him as a character. That finding out, coming to a conclusion about that particular mystery undermines just who he is as a character. So after that point, it's harder to do a story about him. So growing and learning and all that kind of stuff is not necessarily the mark of a great character. Coming to some sort of conclusion about who you are as a person, not necessarily the mark of a great character, but it's the mark of an endpoint of a character. I think they continue to be stimulating, dynamic, interesting, complicated, fascinating characters, partly because of their lack of resolutions. Once they reach resolutions like, Gonzo being part of a species and gaining awareness of who he is as an entity, just undercuts him as a character completely. Really, it's an endpoint to reach. But how do you do a really compelling Gonzo story if he feels like he's part of something? And they're a family together. I mean, that's the thing about the Muppets is they have this sense of family, but it's a codependency in a sense that they have this belonging with each other that they wouldn't find anywhere else. They have this family-like connection with each other that they wouldn't find anywhere else. But it remains to such an abusive. Clearly it's an abusive codependent relationship in the Muppets, but it's this degree of abusiveness to each other and verbal abusiveness. Waldorf and Statler, for example, but they're all just constantly abusing each other verbally and screaming at each other. It remains unsettled to such a degree that it remains compelling. It remains fascinating. Once you close that off and you resolve those things, you end the story. It doesn't improve the story necessarily to come to some sort of conclusion. It's built for long-term storytelling by setting it up in such a way that it remains fascinating and compelling without that resolution. So that undermines some supposed truisms about storytelling. You don't need necessarily a character whose steady progression is towards resolution or change. Long-term storytelling, that dynamic remains open and unresolved. Short-term storytelling, or storytelling with a definite endpoint, something other than episodic television, you can have a character who changes and leads to an endpoint. But anyway, that's the Muppets. That's all for today. I'll see you on the next episode. Say goodbye, Maggie. Can you sing a song like Rolf? Siku! Siku! Siku's asleep. Can you sing a song like Rolf? Can you sing a song like Rolf? No? Just gonna lick my face? Siku, sing a song. Come on. Sing a song. Sing a song. Sing a song. Rainbow Connection. Sing Rainbow Connection. No? Okay, never mind. All right, see you. Oh, God, there they come. See you on the next episode.